Namaskaram. I thought today I would talk about two scientists. Okay, the first one is Einstein, and the second one is Darwin. Okay, so scientists that most people know, I guess. Right? So I heard that most of you are entrepreneurs in the room. The stats I've got is about 75% is from India, 25% from overseas. The median size of the business is about 100 crores in India, and I'm thinking about 30 to 40 million if you're from the overseas. So roughly correct. And what I want to talk to you all about is growth. Okay? Because I think as entrepreneurs, a fundamental thing we need to think of is growth. Right? Indra Newey basically says growth is like oxygen in the room. Right? And I fundamentally believe if companies don't grow, right, they stagnate and die. Right? So a lot of what we want to talk about today is growth and what kind of growth is really possible for each of you. Right? So Einstein talked about what he referred to as the eighth wonder of the world. Right? How many of you kind of know what it was? What did he refer to as the eighth wonder of the world? Compounding. Somebody said that, right? Okay. So he referred to compounding as the eighth wonder of the world. Right? And basically, that's the notion that we're going to talk about first, right? So a lot of you have businesses today, right? Let me ask you, if you have a business that is X, let's just assume 100 crores because that's the medium size of the business today, where would you like to see that business grow to? What times X, right? 5 times X, 10 times X, how much? 10X, okay? Okay, so 10 is the target. If everybody's got a number today, okay? So here's what I want to basically say. If you take, so I think we can just start, I've got 2 slides or maybe 3. So if you think of the eighth wonder, okay, so here's the basic math. If you compound your business at 26% a year, right, over 10 years you're 10x, over 20 years you're 100x, okay, 101x time of business. I don't know what the average age of a person in this room is, I didn't check that. But let's just say you're 30 years old, right? So I would argue you have at least 30 years of compounding, which means 1,000x, right? So actually, if you think of what kind of target you want to set, the simple math is this: at 26% compounding, you can go 10x in 10 years, 100x in 20 years, and 1,000x if you can go 30 years. Okay? The first company I've been involved with is Chola, and that has compounded at a 43% compound average growth rate, and that is now, roughly 58x where we started with, right, kind of 2010. I definitely think that by the time we leave it, we'll hit that 100x target, right? And then the second company basically has been compounding at 57% a year. So that basically is compounding at an even faster rate. But basically, the point I have is, if you're in India today, that's for 75% of the people in this room. I don't know where the geographies of the others. I definitely think that any business you are in, right, has the opportunity to compound at least 26% a year. Right? So what you actually have to ask yourselves is, why are you compounding at that rate? And if not, why not? Right? So first off, so now let's get to why are some companies able to sustain at 26% or at a higher growth rate over a longer period of time, and why are some companies not able to sustain? What do you think? So the profitability, and sorry we showed market cap, the profitability has also been at the same rate. Right. Right. The profitability of Chola, I think, has been slightly lower, so it's about closer to like 37, 38%. It's been compounded at the same rate. So you're saying the total addressable market is huge, right? So now I think the one thing we know in India is you're looking at a particular business as your defined business. You don't need to, right? So the first thing you need to look at whenever you look at a business is, why should this be my defined business, right? There's always enough opportunity in India, right? And so the first thing I would talk about is how you look at it, right? So I'll give you an example on our manufacturing business, right? Is that, when we started in TI, right, we were basically making a profit of about 200 crores a year. And we were supplying automotive components, right, predominantly to kind of most of the auto guys in India. So if I look at my total addressable market as that, right, then I begin to say, okay, there's only that much I can go. but why should that be my total addressable market? So I don't know, how many of you are more manufacturing and industrial businesses? How many of you are more service manufacturing businesses? Okay, so quite a few manufacturing businesses. So I'll tell you, here's the way I see it, right? So the first thing that a lot of companies tend to do, which is a mistake, is that they tend to deploy cash flow that they make into the same business, right? So I'm growing in this business, so I made some cash, I'm going to put the cash back into this business. That's fundamentally not the way I think it should be looked at, right? You should look at one segment as something that's generating cash. That's a cash flow engine. Where you deploy that cash should be dependent on what you see as the best opportunity for that cash, right? And so for us, for example, we take the money out of the auto components business and keep deploying it into other businesses that are growing much faster, right? So you create your own companies within it, right? So fundamentally, I just want to come back to this point that in India, and I think in a lot of other countries of the world, compounding at 26% at least is not a problem over a long period of time, 20 years, 30 years, right? You've really got to start thinking of why, right? What are the bottlenecks in the process, right? And I think that the biggest thing that I saw was there were a lot of things that happened in terms of the way companies were run, right? That basically did not allow them to go out and scale at the rate that they could, right? The first area that I like to talk about is energy and where the energy is focused, right? So the biggest point on, if you begin to look at this, and this is why I say this is the second part of the Einstein discussion, what is Einstein more famous for than the compounding comment? E equal to mc squared, right? So if you take the summation of all the mass in your organization, how much will you end up at? A few tons at least? Yeah? And you multiply that by 9 times 10 to the power 16. How much energy do you have? Close to infinity. Yeah? How much energy of that energy do you think you tap successfully in the organization? What percentage of it? How much? 10? Yeah, so I think 10, if you're tapping 10, that's a good answer, right? We'll get to the Darwin section where I'll ask you if you're tapping 10% of your own energy, right? And that's also an interesting point. I don't know if you were in Surya Kund in the morning doing a sadhana, but you started to tap in more, which is good. But we'll get to that part later. But the first question I always ask is this, right? You look at the energy of an organization and say, where is it going, right? Now, when we talk about energy, how many of you have noticed patterns on energy, right? So I'll say all of you sit in meetings a lot of the day. Okay? Have you noticed that when some people come and enter a room where there's a meeting, the entire energy in the room goes up? A single person enters the room, but it causes the energy in the room to go up. Have people noticed this? Yes? Yeah? So that single person has not just increased, they've just not brought their own energy into the room, they've made the entire energy of the room go up. Yeah? So you've got to think of this as a phenomenon, right? Have you noticed the converse? Right? A person enters the room and the entire energy in the room goes fuss. Notice this? Huh? So the first thing you have to ask yourselves is what kind of energy do you have in your organization? Right? Don't look at your organization as individuals or as people, but look at them as either sources and sinks of energy. Right? So if you begin to look at an organization in this way, you begin to look at an organization very differently. Right? Because you're basically looking at dynamics, you're looking at the kind of energy, how energy is interacting with different energy. It's not people interacting with people, it's energy interacting with energy, right? This becomes very, very interesting to start to observe, right? So the first thing you have to ask yourself, and again we get to more of this in the next session, is what kind of energy are you? Right? Are you the type of person that walks into the room and the energy in the room is going up? Or are you the type of person that is not creating the energy? I'm not going to ask for you to raise your hands on the second part. Okay? Obviously, none of us think that we're the kind of person that walks into the room and the energy goes down, right? But we've got to start asking ourselves this, right? And just start looking at this. Here's the math, which is the summation. If you start thinking of energy, the second part of energy is, where is that energy focused, right? So think of energy as, and again, for the engineers in the room, they'll tell me that energy is a scalar, but think of energy as a vector. Energy with a particular direction. It's focused towards something, right? See, where should the energy in an organization be focused? Where should it be focused? On the customer, right? We're all agreed on that. Which means if you think of the organization as a pyramid, right? You at the top of the pyramid, and then you have this whole structure below you, okay? It should all be focused at which end? Should it be focused up at you, or it should be focused down at the other end, towards the customers? Down at the other end, right? Towards the customers. How many people in their organizations think that energy is focused more towards going up the organization than versus down? Raise your hands, yeah. You think energy is focused up the organization? Yeah? So you see quite a few situations, there are managers who make it their jobs to be good at managing upwards. Who's heard of this term, managing upwards? Right? They become professionals at this. But are they managing in the right direction or the wrong direction? Wrong direction. So you have to start thinking, see, where did this structure come from? Where does the structure of basically the way organizations are set up today, right? Whatever, CEO, CXO layer, whatever, presidents, VPs. Where did this organization structure come from? Anybody? Army, right? The military. It came from the military. So what do you want to happen in the military? You want one person to make a decision and you want everybody else to follow it. Is that how you want your companies run? If that isn't how you want your companies run, then why do you have a structure that basically kind of makes you do exactly the wrong thing, right? You have to think of how you're going to flip this, right? The second thing I would say is that the most energy is actually out in the field. So we use the example of Chola. We have about 55,000 people today, right? Out of them, I would say close to 40,000 are directly in the field, kind of interacting with customers, right? So you have to think of how you're going to switch this energy around, right? Switch the organization around so that the entire organization is supporting those 40,000 people. Because most people don't structure their companies that way. You have to start thinking of how am I going to structure it so that the entire focus is on that, right? So one way to look at it mathematically is, and I apologize, I am an engineer, so I tend to kind of go too geeky on that side, is you think of the summation. So if you think of sigma, x equals 1 to n, of the energy of all the individuals in your organization with the direction in which it's focused, that is the amount of mass output that organization can generate, right? And if you think of how you're going to get that energy just focused in one direction, right? So I'll use another very engineering and technical example. How many of you have seen Finding Nemo? All of you have seen Finding Nemo, okay. So what does Nemo say when they're caught in this net? So all the fish are just scared, right? So they're all swimming in every direction possible, right? And he decides that the energy is channeled in one direction, he can actually create a successful outcome, right? Which is what he does. That's exactly what you need to do with your organizations, right? How do you actually get that energy really channeled in one direction, right? And the moment you start doing that, you will see a lot of things start scaling from an organizational perspective. The second thing I would talk about is if you want to build capacity at this 26%, you need to think of how are you going to build the capabilities of the organization, right? The first thing I keep looking at is that organizations, so if you think about it this way, right? If I need to be 100x within a particular amount of time, right? Right now, it's me. How many of you have been in your job for 5 years plus at a stretch? 5 years plus at a stretch. Okay. Tell me what percentage of your job is the same and what percentage of your job has changed in the last 5 years? 100% has changed. Okay. So what were the things you were doing 5 years ago and what are the things you're doing now? So how many of you have been in a managerial role for the last 5 years or a leadership role for the last 5 years? Now you tell me, what's the answer to the same question? What percentage of your job has changed? 30% has changed. So you look at the math this way, that if 30% changes, you've built the next layer to a level where they can take 30% of your job, which means that 100% of your job will be gone in how many years? 17 years, right? Mathematically, about 17 years, right? Which basically means your capability, right? Just to say, if you got to get like 3 people at the next level, your capability to go 3x is 17 years away. Just look at the maths of it, right? So actually, if you want to basically be able to double every 3 years, which is what compounding at 26% is, you need to say that everything I'm doing now, so this is one rule we have in our company, everything I'm doing in my job, 24 months from now, I should not be doing it, right? And I basically say 100%. What I'm doing in my job, I should not be doing it 24 months from now. Which means that now the next layer, we identify them and say, okay, now how are you guys going to do it? Right? How can you guys start thinking, kind of doing it next from now? Right? So you got to start thinking of what are the concepts. Okay? And again, I'm not talking about a particular type of business. All of these things are most easily solvable. But it's two things, energy and focus. The 2 examples I use of energy and focus. One is the Indian mythology example, which I'll get the story wrong. It was Arjuna, right? They said, what can you see? And he said, I can see the eye of the fish, right? Eye of the bird, sorry. Fish is the other one, right? Ramayana. Okay. Okay. So basically, he was laser focused, right, on that objective, and that is what the company should be focused on, right? The way we do it in Chola and the way we do it in TI is we develop metrics, right? So we have 4 financial metrics in TI, we have two in Chola, and everybody in the company, if you go to somebody, that's like, on the front line, they'll be able to tell you what those metrics are. They'll be able to tell you how they're performing on those metrics, right? You need to educate the entire organization so that everybody in the organization just needs to be focused on that, right? So focus them on something, increase their energy, and keep building capability, right? So these are the 3 simple answers in my mind on the company side, right? Now we'll get to the other side. So we're moving now from Einstein to Darwin. Okay, and before that, so basically when I started, working in my job, when I took over kind of to run the first company, I went to my dad, I said, okay, Appa, you've kind of run companies for a long time. What's your advice to me, And I kind of, I went with like pen and paper and was sitting down ready for a long chat with him, right? So he basically, you know what he told me? What his advice was to me? So he says, the bottleneck of the bottle is always at the top. Okay, this was his line to me. Okay, that's it. Right? No conversation, nothing else. Right? He said, if you're going to be the boss, who is the bottleneck here? So who is the bottleneck here? You guys are, right? So you have to start thinking, if you are the bottleneck, what are you going to do about yourselves? So I'll just use, so this is the second chart, right? If you start thinking of benefit, right? Think of what is your objective in life. What's your objective in life? Anybody? Huh? To grow. Okay. Others? Yeah. To live life. Wow, that's a satsang answer. Okay. Make an impact. Others?
To improve oneself.
Improve oneself. That's a great answer. Okay. And then, so I mean, I am surprised, but none of you said like, happiness, right? Which would be kind of my objective, right? Or did you say happiness? Sorry, I didn't hear you. But I really think that a lot of it is, just how can we be happy while we're here, right? Kind of, and I think I agree with improve oneself. I agree with some of the other concepts as well. But I think happiness is also a big part of it, right? But I think, a question I often ask people is kind of how you set your objective function, right? Because a lot of people, so for example, say, how many of you were excited when you made your first, crore in revenue? How many of you were excited, really excited when you made your first crore in revenue? A lot of you were, right? Now, how exciting was it to go from the first crore to the second crore? Huh? Diminishing, right? So when we go back to that curve, right, you think of most things, right? Is it the curve on the left or the curve on the right? Most things are the curve on the left, right? Most things that you begin to think of have diminishing marginal returns, right? So money, definitely, right? Money and wealth, I think as a whole category, definitely, right? When we think of, most material things we think of in the world, they tend to have diminishing marginal returns, right? And so when you really begin to think of that, you begin to ask, what is a journey for yourself, right? And the way I begin to think of it is there another curve? And honestly, I didn't even know another curve existed before I came to Isha, right? Because that was the starting of another curve, an understanding of another curve for me. And really the way I look at these two curves is this curve, the first curve, right, because it basically becomes parallel to the axis, is basically stagnation over time, right? It leads to stagnation, right? And the second curve is where we get to Darwin, right? Where have we seen the second curve before? On the first slide. On the first slide, we saw the same curve, right? It's basically compounding of the company, right? So we basically say the company is compounding at 26% a year. So this curve is the same curve, right? But what is it talking about? It's not talking about compounding the company anymore. It's talking about compounding oneself, right? So that is my question to you, right? Because the first question I ask, all of you are leading organizations, right? Let's just say we're basically, we started off in Chola, we had 4,000 people. Now across the 3 companies I manage, it's close to like 90,000 people, right? What gives me the right to manage all these other people if I can't manage myself, right? That's something I've got to ask myself before I show up every day. I come out and give you guys gyan. Some of it might be useful, some of it might not. But the question you got to ask yourself is, what gives you the right to do it if you're not actually focused on actually managing yourself more effectively? And that's where I come to this question of personal compounding. What are you doing to compound yourself? And are you compounding at that 26% a year? Here's the way I look at it. 3 decades of compounding means you need to be 1,000x better person than you are. Okay? I started with Isha. That's what you all need to ask yourselves, right? I started with Isha at the same time I started with the first company, right? And if it wasn't for Isha, I don't think the first company would have compounded and continued to compound at that rate, and now the second and now the third, right? But honestly, this is the fundamental question you need to ask yourselves, because I think if we don't answer this, right? And people can say, oh, can you really kind of grow at 26% a year, right? I think 26% itself, depending on kind of, how much you want to move up at that evolution curve, may not be enough, right? So the first thing you have to start thinking is, how are you balancing your own life, right? And, and to me, the only solution I have found to a curve that is basically, exponential versus a curve that is basically what we call the stagnation curve, right? Or a diminishing marginal return curve. The only solution I've found is basically the practices and kind of the path that I have found here. Okay. Because the amazing thing that it makes you recognize is how much the human being can evolve, right? What this thing can do, right? And one of the things that I do for my sadhana is like twice a year I come for silence. And I would actually say that silence is by far the best university in the world, right? What you learn during silence, right? And now I would say I've done it probably 14 times for about 9 days on average, right? And every time, it's like a progressive university, and what you begin to learn, right, about yourself is basically kind of learning from a source that is truly infinite, right? And the way it kind of teaches you in a way that's totally infinite is just mind-blowing compared to what you can learn in any other university in the world, right? So the really question you got to, so that's one of the ways I know. But I think the fundamental question is this, right, that you all really need to address. I think more than your companies, more than anything else, right? I really feel like if you don't compound yourself at that rate, the company will grow, but at some point, you'll hit a roadblock, right? Because either you've not grown as much as the company has, right? Or you'll basically kind of end up facing too much resistance from the people around you, right? Because you constantly got to be thinking of those people as well, right? I mean, and honestly, I'll tell you, it's interesting the way we do it, right? In Chola, already close to 3,000 people have done inner engineering, okay? And now we've signed up to get 10,000 people in inner engineering. So we basically signed up. And 30 of the top managers have all been to Insight, okay? For the first 6 insights, we would bring 5 of the managers here. We would run our strategy sessions after this, kind of in Spanda outside, and we would be done. Strategy for the year would be done kind of in Spanda Hall. We would all be done, and we go back and kind of execute for the rest of the year. Right? So every year we bought kind of, so I would say at least, over the 14 years, at least like 60, 70 people have kind of been from in terms of the leadership roles. And honestly, it's the easiest way to do it, right? Because I feel like if you can kind of learn and imbibe in an environment like this, it's so much easier to implement because you've got the entire organization aligned. Right? Everybody is beginning to think the same way. Because otherwise, you guys go back and then you go and give them all of the ashram dope. And they'd be like, boss, where did you come from, right? I mean, you go back to your ashram, that stuff works there, but it doesn't work here, right? So you really got to think of how you get people onto the same wavelength, right? Because that's very important as well. So really this thing on your personal paths, you have to think about, right? Because if you personally don't scale yourself, it's like a double helix, right? How many of you are familiar with the double helix structure? Okay? DNA, right? It's the core of life, right? And that's the way this thing works, right? First that scales, then this scales, then this scales, then this scales. And it keeps building on each other. The two feed off each other and build on each other. That's how you've got to think of this, right? Where the organization goes, where you go. These two things have to keep building on each other, right? You can't push yourself and then, you'll have all this energy and say, what do I do with this energy? And that's where you need some place to express it. Then that place kind of feeds off what you're doing and saying that's going to scale more. And the two just keep feeding off each other, right? And so soon you reach a situation where you can't stop it. You take yourself out of the situation, it still keeps going, right? That's the energy you got to create in the place, right? So that's how you got to think of yourselves. That's how you got to think of your companies. Okay, so let me stop with that. I'll be happy to turn it over to Q&A. But namaskaram. Thank you so much.
How do you make sure, or how do you get your employees on board for inner engineering? Is it mandated, a mandated policy at your company, or? Yeah,
I think that's a good question, especially when you're coming from outside the country. You were doing your sadhana this morning in Surya Kund Mandapam. But it's a good question. We don't mandate it, okay? But I'll tell you, it's like, you've got to become a kind of example in the company where people are asking, what is this guy smoking? Right? I mean, that's what you want, right? You want to create an environment where everybody is like, so you go out there and they're like, man, what is this guy on, right? I mean, he's on something, right? And then you say, like, this is what I'm smoking, right? I'm smoking the ashram, right? So why don't you come and smoke in the ashram with me, okay? And that's what and that's the only way to do it, right? So because honestly, then we had our first set of people, and like one of the things I said to our leadership team after the first time we said is, let's all do inner engineering together, right? And kind of, and we all did it as a team together, right? And then we would kind of take a break off, from our meeting, and then all of us would be doing Shambhavi and then coming back, and so. But I think you got to create that culture where people really see that it is bringing something different to the table, right? I don't think mandating works. It's probably the worst way because people think they're going to get forced into it. I mean, you could say, hey, in India you can mandate, we can't mandate where we are. Sorry, I don't know where you work, but the point is, mandating never works, right? You just got to become an example that people say, wow, I want to have what they're having, right? And that's the only way that kind of really works.
And Vellayan, you're not only smoking the ashram, you've taken the ashram to your office, minimalist, sit on the floor kind of stuff.
That's it. My office setup is I've got ashram seating, courtesy Kanika, my wife here, so I sit on the floor and I've got Devi right next to me. So yes.
My question is, when you took over from your dad, the ownership, at that time, was it 26% or was it less? And how did you propel the energy?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. First off, I didn't take over from my dad, but I'll talk about the two companies I took over. So when I took over Chola as a company, it had a market cap of about 1,600 crores. We showed the compounding there. But basically, the company was actually in a very bad shape, right? So it was like almost dead. It was close to dead, right? Basically, because again, its profitability was close to zero. We had an anemic ROA, what's called a return on assets in a financial services business. We had like a 0.1% ROA and virtually no growth, right? It had been through a really tough time where the family had to put in a bunch of money into the business and the business was close to kind of dying. So my family actually asked me to come in to turn around the company. They actually gave me two options. They said either I come in to turn around the company or they wanted to sell it. They wanted to sell it to DBS, the Singapore bank. And I just said, no way, we'll take it, right? And now it's the most valuable company in the group. Same story with TI. Basically, before we started, so the four financial metrics we focus on TI are sales growth or revenue growth, PBT to sales, free cash flow to PAT, and return on invested capital. So those are the four financial metrics we focus there. So for the 10 years before I joined, the revenue growth had been close to 4%. Free cash flow to PAT had been at 44%. PBT to sales of 4.7 and ROIC of 14. We took targets and now basically revenue growth exceeds 18% a year. Free cash flow to PAT has been close to 85% plus every year. Profitability has been 13% to sales and ROIC is more than 33%. So every metric has moved significantly in both the companies. So no, and by the way, just to give you a sense, both companies have exactly the same people, okay? Only two external managers have been brought in both companies over the last, I would say, 2 decades, right? 15 years. So it's exactly the same people. And that's a very important point as well. The same people have the capability in them, right? It's just innate. There's that energy in you, but it's just innate. It's not channeled effectively. So the question is, how do you channel that energy effectively? How do you get them focused on the right things? And then the same people now are just so charged up that that's what I'm saying, that even if I remove myself, kind of the same engine will keep going, right? Because that's what you need to do. So you need to make yourself obsolete, but you also need to get the people charged up, because I really feel like any company in this country can do it, right? There's so much opportunity for India where it is today, right?
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask a question on execution, Vellayan.
Yeah, sure.
One of the remarkable things is about how you turned around multiple companies, and I've seen CG Power, which you acquired, debt-ridden, close to bankruptcy, 1,300 crore losses, and within a year it flips to 1,300 crore profit. So while you're saying harness the best out of the people, how do you actually do it in practice? What's your execution engine?
Yeah, so again, right, I mean, I tend to see these things as just kind of, you need to understand that context, right, and see what's required. I mean, everything like we know is like very contextual, and that's the danger with giving kind of generic answers, right? But I will tell you what was needed there, right, which is basically, like if you take TI and CG, which were both manufacturing companies, a general approach has been to try and identify, you need to bring a certain amount of, you need to infuse a certain amount of kind of energy into the company in the beginning. So here's how we did it in both organizations, which is they'll be used to a certain rhythm, right? Most organizations are used to a certain rhythm. Now we have our monthly reviews, we have our quarterly meetings, so on and so forth. So what we did is that basically we said, okay, these are the 4 financial metrics. We want to move these 4 financial metrics this much in this year. Now, what are the component factors of that? We identified 9 areas of work. One will be on cash flow improvement, one will be on profitability improvement, one will be on marketing mix or sales mix, one will be on operations and productivity. 9 areas. We identified 75 project teams, so involved the entire company. And basically, I would individually review every one of those project teams every 2 weeks, right? So for the first 6 months, the company is suddenly like, whoa, what hit us, right? Because you suddenly bought like what was operating at a particular pace, right? Say you're ambling along, and then you're suddenly saying, okay, now you got to run, you got to start kind of running at a particular pace. So they begin to identify that a huge change has happened in that momentum. And you need to start, that's what starts generating this kind of engine. So you just got to think of how you're going to generate that level of momentum. The company has got to be operating at a very, very different level and a very, very different speed. So that's how you start that process and then start driving from there.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, yeah, you. Yeah.
Namaskaram. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Do you use any additional instruments like Devi Yantra in your, I don't know, office, and how it impacts? Yeah. Thank you.
Any tools to help? Anyway, yeah. So to your answer, I smoke all the ashram dope. I have Devi in my office. We have Devi at home. And yes, I mean, so if you're asking me kind of, what individual elements kind of, I just think that honestly, the amazing thing, about yoga in itself is that there are a million different paths, right? And actually, I've seen which path you kind of get more on will also changes with time.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, I've been, like I said, I mean, the company chart was for 14 years. I've been practicing, Isha for like 13 years. And I've also seen things change with time, including which kind of practice is my favorite, right? I mean, like whether Shakti Chalan is my favorite or kind of this thing practice is your favorite over time. So basically, there are definitely things that change with time. But the beauty of having this variety is that, that it never gets too monotonous, right? Because there's always so much choice, right? So you just kind of pick, like if you say you'll do like, 4 hours of sadhana a day, I don't know how much you're on, but if you say you'll do 4 hours of sadhana a day, there's enough variety, right? I mean, so if you like Angamarna for a while, you do that. If you need to switch to something else, you do that. And that's a good thing, because I think if it got too monotonous a path, I don't think a lot of us would stay on it, right? I mean, like a lot of us stay on it because there's enough variety, and it kind of helps intensify, right? One reinforces the other. And that's the amazing thing, that they all reinforce each other, right? And that's what I've seen and I've observed over time. They all reinforce each other.
Excellent. Okay, here.
So I have this question that how much the growth that has happened in the companies that you've taken over, how much do you think relies on the skills of the employees and the people who are in the company when you come at a point where it's on a very low phase? And I'm asking this question because I heard your previous talk, which was in FAMX. You mentioned that your retirement plan is to come to Isha, and you'll be working with a lot of people who don't have the skills, so what do you want them to do? So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
So I would actually say that, a lot of people think that it's professional qualifications, is all of this other stuff. But to me, and I think a lot of us kind of know this at work, right? I mean, if you had to choose between skill and will, I would 80% go for will, not for skill, right?
Wow.
Because the rest can be kind of developed, right? And that is what is naturally here, right? I mean, that's what is naturally there with everybody that basically comes to this place, right? And I'll tell you, that's what makes the ashram itself, that compounding curve, right? Because you basically think of it as kind of, in itself, it's basically reinforcing. It's reinforcing different kinds of energy, right? I mean, even the grace that you see in the place is reinforcing because what everybody kind of brings to it, right? So it makes it a compounding force, right? And that's what it effectively creates.
Okay, you, yeah.
My question's on the metric side. So you mentioned in the companies that you run, there's metrics that a lot of your employees can quote back at you and they're like, this is what we're aiming for. Are those outcome metrics or are those process metrics, and how do you see that?
Yeah.
And just to follow up on the Darwin side, in terms of like personal growth, I think the process metrics, I mean, I'm also kind of engineering-y, and so I measure, how much practices am I doing, how regularly am I doing? So it's easy to capture the process metrics. Is there anything that you've thought about to capture the outcome metrics on the Darwin side? Anything on that would be interesting to hear. Thanks.
So first, on the company side, it is, the four metrics that I talked about for TI and CG and the two metrics for Chola are all outcome metrics, right? And so then we follow Hoshin Kanri, which is, some of you might know it. It's basically, it's a policy deployment metric, technique to basically take it down all the way the organization to the bottom layer, right? So that's basically what we do there. And obviously, as you kind of go deeper down the Hoshin Kanri pyramid, you will basically end up in input metrics as well. But predominantly, we stay focused on outcome metrics. And what we do is educate employees, right? So when we started at Chola, there were only 4 people who managed a P&L, right? And the first thing we did was go to all 1,200 branch managers and say, we actually taught them what a P&L was, what a balance sheet was, right? And then we said, okay, this is what we want you to manage. Because fundamentally, I talked about inverting that pyramid, right? I just said, this command and control structure doesn't work. So I just said, okay, now these are the guys managing P&Ls, right? Nobody else manages a P&L, only the 1,200 of them, right? And all we're doing is supporting them and how they manage their P&Ls. So still very focused on outcome metrics. But so for the most part, I would say that when it comes to companies, I would say much more focused on outcome metrics. When it comes to the personal side, I think you'll drive yourself bonkers trying to manage or measure outcome metrics, right? Or if you're married and have kids, you'll definitely drive your family bonkers, even if you don't drive yourself bonkers. So I wouldn't advise that. You can do like, check-ins every once in a while, or, I think like tools like have you seen the Sadhana Pada journal? Okay, so by the way, I don't know if we can share kind of, the journaling that Sadhana Pada does, or kind of something like that, but, I don't know what's like this thing or not. By the way, I don't know how many, so I mean, that's one way to kind of really kick off a compounding curve. Huh? So Sadhana Pada, I think, is kind of an amazing program that the ashram has. Actually, our son's in Sadhana Pada this year. And he's 22, right? So the good thing is, hopefully he'll have at least 40 years of compounding, right? And so you begin to look at the maths and a lot of the young people doing it. I mean, I feel like I started my Isha journey too late, right? I was at 42. But I think for the people starting at a much younger age, I think it's just like the most kind of mind-blowing kind of thing you have. But I don't think you should try to measure outcome metrics. That's just a personal view, okay? And that's not like the satsang version of the answer. You had Sadhguru yesterday. You should have asked him that question.
My question is, let's say, now I'm running an organization, doing typically well. We are growing, finance is doing well. But somehow, you feel a lot of things stopping you from the growth, what you can do. So typically, one of the bottlenecks you talk about, definitely, we get to hear that.
Dad, when you're not there, the office works
better. Correct.
So,
yeah.
You got to change that.
Yeah.
And also bring happiness into the organization. So how do you identify which are the areas which are probably need correction? And let's say you spoke about 9 steps or 9 things what you typically when you take up an organization. How do you identify that these are the areas you got to begin first, address, and get on to the next level into the whole thing?
Okay, so I don't know if there was a question within a question there, and I'm assuming kind of you're the dad in that scenario. Okay, so there could be a question within a question there, and I think that often that is the most important dynamic. I'm a 4th generation family business, and I think this dynamic is also very relevant, right? So first to your question on how do you identify what's right or wrong. So first you got to think, right, which is basically, it's part of the thing is you're thinking of what you think is right or wrong, right? And part of what was implied in your question is that your kids may not think that that is what is kind of the same thing, right? How to create that alignment itself is very important, right? And also, so in general, what I've seen kind of there is that alignment, unless it starts very early, is tough to develop, right? And the second thing is it's also useful to understand when generations should be in and when generations should kind of be out. But, I honestly think that you need to, like, so for example, if you notice a particular thing is not happening, right? You need to identify where's your challenge. That's why I'm saying it's very difficult to answer in a generic context. Is it revenue growth that's a problem? Is it profitability that's a problem? Is it the fact that the TAM is not big enough that's a problem? And for each one of those, so I think that's easy to understand. At an outcome metric level, like he said, it's fairly easy to see where are you challenged right now, right? And then it's simply a question of how do you drill into that, right? I mean, and so it's how do you go very deep into that area? So if it's revenue growth, that's a problem. How do I go very deep into that area? What are the 10 things that can be there from a revenue growth perspective? So just drilling very deep into that. But first use the outcome metric to determine what is the metric that is challenged today, right? And then drill down into that to basically identify what the root cause is at that level.
Yeah. So before the next question, I just wanted to ask one question. It's about risk-taking, Vellayan. And, in the recent past, you've invested in semiconductors, taken TI to EVs and stuff like that. How do you think, smaller entrepreneurs or upcoming entrepreneurs should look at risk and manage risk?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, it's risk again is this, it's a very broad term in terms of the way that the term itself is used, right? Because I often attribute it to, it's honestly most things that are in a corporate world, and that's why I talked about a double helix is very important. You think of what is the personal parallel, right? What is stopping me from doing X, right? And the single thing that I kind of usually relate it to is fear, right? Fear, right? Personal fear. Whoa, am I doing the right thing? When we bought CG Power, it was a company that there had been fraud, right? 3,500 crores, almost $500 million had been taken out of the company, right? It was COVID. Nobody wanted to touch this asset with a barge pole, right? And there's no counterparty that we were buying the asset from. So we find out anything that's wrong after we buy it, it's our problem, right? And basically, I studied it enough and I just said, hey, listen, I think that this is a good asset. You just form a point of view. But more important, right? Think about it. We bought it in COVID. We didn't visit a single plant, right? We didn't visit a single plant because we couldn't. It was COVID. We couldn't travel. We couldn't meet any of the people. We couldn't visit a single plant. But we bought the asset. It turned out to be the best investment we made. But you have to think about it this way, right? Personally, like let's just say you have a committee, okay? A committee cannot make that decision because a committee is going to say they're always going to go for the safe option, right? And that's why I'm saying you think about it as a personal characteristic. There's a fear in you that's saying, oh, what if I'm doing the wrong thing? Now again, that's where I come back to, if you're doing your sadhana, I tell you, like, one thing that will definitely go away with time is fear, okay? I think fear is an absolutely useless human emotion, right? Fear came to us again in a Darwinian way. Where did fear come from? Where is fear placed in us from? Survival, right?
Yeah.
So is survival really a challenge? I mean, what is the chance that like a tiger is going to come and eat us, like sitting in this conference room today, right? Unless, and so basically it's not. But that instinct is so embedded in us, right? So we really have to think of ourselves saying, why is this instinct so embedded in us? And then we corporatize this instinct by calling it risk, right? So then we say, oh, this is a very risky transaction. Actually, it is collective fear embodying itself in that risk. Right? So then you have to ask yourself, saying, hey, listen, is this fear real? Right? And when you really begin to think of it, fear is I don't know, and maybe I'm kind of saying the wrong thing, but I really feel like fear is a fairly unnecessary emotion, right? Because it's causing you to do things that in a calm state, right, your mind would be willing to do, but then fear is saying, oh, no, there's a risk in this, don't do this. But in a calm state or in an exuberant state, like Sadhguru says, is when you're thinking your best. So why should you kind of then downsize that or kind of do this with this element of what you would call fear or risk, right? And so that's the way I look at it. And honestly, I would say that I don't think I'm making more risky decisions, but I'm making less fearful decisions. And I think that there's a big difference between those
Wow.
two.
Okay, we have time for one last question, but somebody who really, really wants to ask question can't leave the room without it. Okay, so with gestures, hand gestures, that's fine. Rest of you can kind of catch up with him.
Hi, namaskaram. I'm Mona from Toronto, Canada. Your personal compounding diagram was the most brilliant representation I have ever seen of the benefits of Isha practices. So thank you for that. I have two questions. One, do you speak to CEOs across the globe and present this? And I would love to invite you to Canada. I will organize 50 of the top CEOs in Toronto to hear you speak. And my second question, because your insight is already phenomenal, what lesson are you still learning?
Yeah, so I don't. So by the way, I did spend like 3 months of my life at a boarding school near Toronto. So I'd be happy to come back there. I'd kind of love to do that at some point. To your question on what am I still learning, I would still say that kind of, I'm still in kindergarten, okay? I think I've just made it out of nursery and into kindergarten, right? I think, you see some of the Swamis and Ma's here, and, you just learn how much you have to learn when you see them, right? It's truly phenomenal because, you can see evolution, right? And a lot of them I've known before there was Swamis and Ma's, and now they are Swamis and Ma's. But it's not just them. You just see so many people here, and you just see the amount that there is to learn. And personally, I'm telling you, every time, you go through silence, it's like, there are things being taught. You just realize how little of a day you are actually conscious about what you're doing, right? And when you're conscious and when it kind of brings in these kind of, some of it you can't even explain, right? Because it's just like, it's because through science, I don't think it can be, through what's interpreted and understood by modern day science, I don't think it can be this thing, because there are things, there's like what I would call a supreme intelligence that's actually teaching you things here, right? And you just realize that, how much you, even I would say I don't know how many 100 years of compounding at this rate, there'd still be so much to learn. Right? And still be so much to, somebody said improve yourself. That's exactly what it is, right? There's so much opportunity to improve yourself on a constant basis, right? And so if you just kind of, you understand that, I had a third slide, right? And kind of it talked about, insignificance versus significant, right? And a lot of us want to be significant in some way, right? But really just going through that process, right, just kind of makes you understand that, right, that your insignificance in itself is just such an opportunity for growth, right? And I just think that it's that in itself, I can't even describe, because you're asking me to say one thing that I'm still learning. I'm just saying that there are like 1,000 things I'm still learning, right? And that's the only way to put it, right? And kind of honestly, and you understand that in its full gravity, you can't, I come back here twice a year, because this is the only university in which I can basically learn that. That's the only university in which I can really understand that, right, at a really, really core level, right? And so I think it's just amazing from that perspective.
So you talked a lot about growth in a manufacturing company, and you led one very series of them, your family. A large number of the smaller manufacturing companies, 200, 500, 700,000 crores, have two major issues, which I want you to address. One is finance, because without finance you can't grow. And the other one is inability to create the bottom line the way the top management wants to. Either because of competition, either because of the geopolitical situation, either because of attrition in labor. The industry where I come from, that is a very, very big issue. We lose manpower like there's no work in the country. And so how does this sector of the economy, which is a vital sector of the economy, feed the economy?
Right. So I think your question on SMEs is very valid, right? But I would say that also what's happening with SMEs in this country today, right? If you see now, right, kind of like, I would say like almost like 20% of kind of new entrants into stock market listings are companies that have been SMEs a decade ago, right? So basically to your question, that means that, a certain percentage of the SMEs are getting answers to these questions, right? So the question is, how are some people able to do it and some not? Okay, so if you think about finance, right? Honestly, I would think, and again, we heard a startup, urban company kind of talk last. What I would say in India today, right, is if you have a good story, right, you can get funded, right? You have to have a good story. You have to be able to sell yourself well. There is so much capital in this country today, right? I don't think it's not necessarily debt capital. Debt capital for SMEs, I do understand and agree is a challenge, but equity capital is available, right? And so I think if people have, the right idea and have enough conviction and can sell that idea well, and I think a lot of that comes back to kind of the energy they project when they kind of communicate. Men and women that really kind of sell themselves well are the ones that basically kind of are able to attract the funding, and they've been able to grow, right? The second issue, I think, is a very, you talked about kind of, people and workforce, for example, right? And again, I think it is how you work with those people, right? How you basically kind of engage them in a way that can be very different, right? And make them feel that they are not, like you said, kind of a lot of people who just treat their kind of, their frontline manufacturing labor as variable labor, I think have the toughest time, right? But making them understand why they are important, kind of giving them context. I don't know where you are, by the way, but again, there's a brilliant, Isha program called Uyirnokum. I don't know if you've heard of it, especially in the south. And we've done Uyirnokum with kind of with some of our manufacturing frontline. And it really makes them understand kind of the context as well, right? Kind of, and you need to bring a deeper meaning to them. Right? The same compounding we're talking about for us, why should it just apply to us? That same compounding has to apply to them. And you need to make them understand how there's a possibility for them to do it as well. Right? So you need to bring a greater sense of meaning and context for them. And I think if you do that, it's very, very doable.
I'm tempted to ask this question because of two reasons. One is because you briefly alluded to Kanika's role in the context of, redesigning your office space in a way that is more conducive for you to do what you're doing. And also because I have been personally a witness in some ways to the journey that you have undergone. And I remember very well that it was Kanika who actually brought the ashram dope to you. She's the one who did the inner engine program first. And I remember volunteering in that program, meeting Kanika, and then the program that you did and you did. So I just wanted to, specifically the role that Kanika has played, but also more generally for the benefit of the audience here, I would like you to share the role that the significant other plays in a journey like this. And because we have the benefit of having Kanika amongst us, after you have answered, I would also request Kanika to share her thoughts.
Yeah, no, Namaskaram, absolutely. Thanks. You want to come up? Come. Yeah. Anyway, so Kanika is my wife. So just so you all know, like Momita said, actually how we came to Isha was because of Kanika. Actually, Kanika came to Isha first. And I remember telling Kanika when she was going to Isha, I said, don't go to all these ashram places, right? It's just not a good idea. And she wanted to go somewhere for her 40th birthday. And I'm like, not a good idea at all. I'm not sure about, these ashram places. And then you have these people who call themselves gurus. And I'm not sure that that's a good idea as well, And I remember her calling me from, so the program was called In a Way. And she called me from there and she said, hey, you should really come to this thing, right? Because it's really something different. And I resisted it for a while. But finally, who's stronger in this relationship? And Kanika convinced me to come over. And obviously, obviously, right, I think kind of the good thing is that we've both been kind of very, very strongly associated with Isha ever since. And I really think that, to Momita's question, I think for most of us, we do know that, that there's always a silent force that is much more powerful than the force that talks a lot. So you know who's been talking a lot, right? So this is the silent force behind my life. And we have 2 great kids. And like we said, our eldest son just finished his undergrad. And straight after his undergrad, he came to Sadhana Pada. So hopefully that tradition will continue into the next generation as well. And so the good thing is kind of like, both our kids kind of practice. One's doing a lot more in Sadhana Pada and one's still in college. And so kind of both of them are in it as well. You want to say a few things? I'm kind of listening.
Namaskaram. So I came to the ashram for my 40th birthday, not for the birthday, but I wanted to do something a bit more introspective than a party, having a party. So, so I came and I met Momita and a few others, and I think I was on the fence, like Vellayan was, I was too, because I was not looking for a guru. I was had always pursued yoga, but that was more the Western style of yoga, more of it as an exercise form to stay fit rather than any deeper reason. And for me, really, it's interesting in the context of the talk that Vellayan has just had. Actually, after the program, on the last day, we had gone for a walk on what is, I think, stream number 1. And we were all sitting in a satsang with Sadhguru. And there was an Orthodox Jewish couple from New York in our program who asked Sadhguru this question. And they basically said, there have been a lot of spiritual thinkers in the East who've contributed a lot to spirituality, but who in your mind has contributed the most in the West? And it was Sadhguru's answer that blew me away. He basically said Charles Darwin. And this couple said, but like an evolutionary biologist, how does that make sense? So he basically said that, it is only when you believe in growth and that you can be something more than what you are today, that there is room for spirituality. If you believe that we go as we come, it leaves absolutely no room for growth or spirituality. And that's when I made the call to Vellayan and said, you should try this. There's just one other thing I'd like to say is that, silence, like Vellayan does twice a year, almost 10 days of silence. But aside from that, I would say I do my best to offer him silence at home. So we do our morning practices together, and I would say they are laced with a little bit of competition because he's making his a la carte for that morning and I'm making mine, and we both compare notes every so often, but mostly silent. But on a more somber note, I have seen such a drastic change in Vellayan over the years because I feel like among other things, I think he spoke about fear, but I feel like even in our circle of friends and among the business community that we are a part of, I see a lot of people cling to power because you do not want to make yourself dispensable. So almost like fear of dispensability. And I see on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, Vellayan doing things where I feel like, he's lost that fear of dispensability. And I think that's wonderful to watch.
And I think that's the right note and the right time to kind of close this session. Vellayan, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful session. Can we give him a big round of applause?